The strategy of Israel in its northern front against the Shiite axis is to prevent the basing of power, to prevent the building of power that would threaten Israel, and to reduce exposure to security threats in that area. The northern front is the #1 security threat on Israel right now, and Syria is the axis that allows it to exist. We want to prevent that by distracting them, by destabilizing them, by reducing their ability to build power. This isn't only about Syria. This is about Hezbollah, this is about Syria, this is about Iran. Let's talk about what we're going to do. We're going to establish military connections with the Kurds in the northern part of Syria. We're gonna actually, if we do bombings of convoys and weapon systems within Syria, if that happens, we're going to do that also when they happen in the north side of Syria, when they threaten Kurdistan. We're going to give them some amount of financial support. We're going to give them a large amount of military support. How does this look like? Essentially, an Israeli Quds force. We're going to give them intel about basings in Syria, of Iran, of Syria, of the Syrian army, of people who threaten them. We're going to buy Mossad action if it's necessary, transfer them weapons. We're going to put on pressure on the U.S. to help them on the airspace on the ground, closing airspace to Syrian action if that's applicable. We don't know if that happened, but we're going to lobby the U.S. to do that. Why do we need to do that? The bottom line of that is allowing these people who are more than willing tools to disturb the Syrian army, the establishment of Iranian presence in Syrian space, to an actor that is very much willing to do that. Let's talk about the situation in Syria right now and why the Shiite axis is so threatening, and therefore why it's the strategy of Israel to contain it as much as possible. Peace is not an option here, right? We need to contain them as long as we can, as far as we can. Syria is the axis where Lebanese Hezbollah gets its weapon, both to the Syrian army and both from Iran. These weapons are long-range missiles, very precise missiles that could harm civilian, that are likely to harm civilian targets in Israel, in Tel Aviv, way beyond, as Nasrallah once said, beyond Haifa. We're talking about the entirety of Israel, civilian targets, power plants, military targets, political targets. That's the place where Iranian forces are basing themselves in bases across the Syrian territory, which enables them to gather strategic information against Israel. We have seen multiple drone reconnaissance missions crossing that border between Israel. We think we have the presence of the Quds force in an area that is within the Golan Heights area, enabling them to also reconnaissance there and maybe take out actions if they think they want to. We see the S-300 weapon system deployed within Syria, which is a massive deterrent against Israeli Air Force acting within the Israeli Air Force, Israeli airspace, and also the neighboring states. Again, if according to sort of forces, that's something that we want to do. And we have, after a decade of fighting that is finally over in Syria 1, an army that is experienced, that has its structures well tested and well deployed, that knows what it's doing, as an actual concrete threat on Israel after years of fighting and after supplies from Iran, from Russia, that is, again, after the 2010s, again, a strategic threat on Israel, but more than that. That means that our strategy is to destabilize them, to destabilize the basings of Iranian forces within that area, which means if we can, bombing bases and weapon caches and all the things like that, and to draw their attentions away from Israel as far as we can. And the north of Syria is excellent for that with its population of Kurds. I'll take OO.
Why do you think countries like the US or Turkey were unable to stabilize Syria?
We're not after stabilizing Syria. We're against that. The reason that I don't think they tried, actually. I think they tried to help other forces there, but also the presence of Russia and Iran there probably didn't help things. I'm not sure what you're after. Our goal isn't to stabilize Syria. And also, we don't think that will destabilize them because we don't think that they are as strong, but we want to draw their attention away. The Kurds are a massive, massive asset to that. First of all, they're capable. They're small, they've been beaten pretty hard, but they still hold territory. You know that the faction that lost the Syrian civil war is the Syrian rebels, not the Kurds, who still hold massive territory at the north of that country, and also at the north of Iraq, which is currently under the sway of Iran. The Peshmerga are formations that Israel is not willing to do because it doesn't want to put boots on the ground, it doesn't want to expose itself to risk at that level. We think that's a Iranian control, Iranian establishment, actually military bases that are filled with Iranian officials and officers and weapon systems that we now have a maybe capability to strike that we wouldn't have otherwise. The comparative to that, in the point of view of Israel, also needs to be considered here because it's way more exposure. What Israel would have to do without this alliance is continue the campaign, if it happens, of bombing Syrian targets, Iranian targets, within Syria is what I meant, having way more danger for its own air force, a way more chance of escalating conflict, because if an Israeli fighter is down and the fighter is killed, there will be a war. There will be a war with Israel against the Syrian army, and that army is way more established. That will be a way higher death toll. Distracting them and taking them away to an enemy that isn't Israel, that is on the far side of that country, is a way better alternative to that, which means that Israel needs to do less strikes on its own, is exposed less, and the risk for all-out war is lessened from that. We think all of these are in the strategic interest of Israel, and so we are very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for this speech, and now I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
All right, perfect. Just to confirm, I did not want to be streamed on this motion. I hope that was clear.